I think that as the teacher, trying to keep an inquiry from just going anywhere and being a free-for-all is you have to scaffold it from the beginning using some techniques that we talked about in the class, such as brainstorming as a group and finding pathways for the students to take, especially early on in the year where you don't want it to be a free-for-all, because as you go on with your students and as they're ready to take on more ownership of an idea, then you can pull away some of that scaffolding. But as the teacher, you're there to set the tone and get everyone started on a specific path.
She need to know her students, their interest, their likes, their dislikes, and then she would need to be able to ask them questions to get them to understand how to ask a question. A lot of kids want to know why, but they don't ask. Why is not really specific, and to get to the why, you have to go through the specifics.
If there are any students in your class that you're still not really, you don't know what their capabilities are, this is a great way to get into their mind and see what they're actually thinking, because they start asking questions out loud, and so you can see where their thought processes are going.
Any child can do it, even if you think that they're not going to be successful. It's the process that matters, and that it really is a lot of fun, and it's really a great learning experience for your students.
It certainly provides a guideline with what I need to do in the school year. Inquiry is the tool that I use to get those things done. The standards just tell me this is what, for example, an 8th grader, this is what an 8th grader needs to know how to do. Well, it's up to me to decide how I want to teach that. And inquiry is just one additional tool that I have to teach those things.
There is definitely a lot of value in inquiry teaching. It teaches your students to think for themselves. Some teachers don't think that it is helpful for the SOLs, but it really is. These SOLs are causing the students to have to really think for themselves and really put their knowledge to the test. And I really think that inquiry is a way to help them do that without them even necessarily realizing that they're doing it. It's fun, it gets them involved. And even if you have behavior problems, I think that you'll find if you try it that honestly, those behavior problems, once those students are engaged, that's really probably where a lot of your behavior problems lie, is the fact that those students have disengaged themselves from the learning process. And once they're more engaged in the learning process, then I think that you'll find that those behaviors aren't necessarily going to be there. They will be excited about science. They will come in a good mood, excited, happy, they'll stay awake, they'll be involved, and I think that it actually has helped behavior in my classroom over the last few years.
The teacher has to know their content very well to be able to fit inquiry with that. I think a lot of content is taught in inquiry. You just have to be able to pull out that content and see what the students are actually learning, so that way you can assess them on that.
Okay, so Renee and I are going to talk about reaching all students, because you've heard various from advanced to students who have special disabilities. Again, I taught 6th grade students, but they were doing the 7th grade math, so most of my students overall were, I would say, I don't want to call them advanced, but they were more prepared to learn the 7th grade material, so they were ready to move on.
I'm Renee Hansel. I teach at Advent High School, and I'm a special education teacher, so I had a small group to work with varying disabilities. So the second part, I'll be discussing how it affected my students.
Okay, so as we said before, I think background knowledge is basic knowledge of what your students already know. You can do that by looking at the previous standards versus the current standards. What's the same, what's different? Another way you can do that is to pre-assess. And then to know their learning styles, I think she pointed out, Dee Dee pointed out earlier how some kids, or even as adults, some are visual. And so my principal gave us, at the very beginning of this year that we started, she gave us a color personality quiz. And I took that back in my classroom because I wanted to see what colors my students were, and then they stood for something. So I'm going to have Miss Arlene click on that. But this was a great way to see how my students learned, how they liked learning, what they enjoyed, were they sports, were they artistic. And so I'm going to have you scroll down to the colors. Okay, so red, yellow, green, and there are different ones. There's a true personality color quiz, but after we did this, we kind of talked, and I had people put up there where they were, like blue, creative. And I noticed that some of my kids who were blue, I didn't have very many of them, but I noticed on the projects, they were the ones who really wanted to draw the pictures. So that was kind of like their part. I also had green, who were controls, and I had one kid who was very specific. You're going to do this and this and this, and I'll do this. So there are kids, and if you know their colors, or if they know their colors, they kind of work together in a group. And I felt like that helped me at the beginning of the year for me to get to know them. And it was very interesting as to what I thought they would be, and it came out something totally different. So anyways, I think a color quiz at the very beginning of the year, if you want to get to know your kids, is a great way. Just kind of like an icebreaker too. Okay, as I said earlier, I think knowing your previous standards versus your current standards is just to know, look at what they need to know from the Virginia curriculum. And then this data could also be used as a pre-assessment. I did this earlier, but this time it's with quadrilaterals. So from 5th grade, it really helped me to know that the kids actually knew what bisecting was. I was afraid when they came to 7th grade that they weren't going to understand what bisecting diagonals were. And because when I pre-tested that, I learned that because they subdivided plane figures in 5th grade, they actually understood what bisecting was. So that was very helpful for me. And so these were just some things in common from 5th, 6th, and 7th. This is just one part of a pre-assessment. So on my open inquiry on quadrilaterals, I wanted to be able to tell, did they know what shapes were what by just looking at a pictorial image. And so that's all I wanted them to do. And so you can see that's one of my objectives that I wrote for the lesson. I believe I had 2 more, but I just wanted to, could they identify and label the shapes? And surprisingly, they really struggled with a rhombus, a trapezoid, and a parallelogram. They really struggled on those 3 shapes, and I was surprised with that. Okay, so pre-assessment, I know we talked about this earlier, but for me, it was not graded. It was just for me to collect the data to see where the kids were, what they struggled with, what they knew things about. They really struggled with a technology-enhanced question, like selecting all that are true. And so I actually did put that on my pre-assessment, and surprisingly, at the end, when I retested, most kids did much better on the TEI, especially comparing and contrasting. My question was a rhombus and a square. And somebody answered this question earlier, but I used my pre-assessment, especially for a structured and a guided, to group students together with like scores, so that we would not have one particular strong leader. All right, so I'm going to try to explain this as best as I can. I had 2 classes. I did my inquiry in both of my advanced classes. As you can see, there's a student 1 and a student 2 that are high. One was taken from one class and one for the other. I had 2 students that were in my advanced. They were about the middle. They did fairly well when I'm looking at their common assessments, and 2 students that are low. If I look at the pre and post test, the first score in the black is the pre-test, the second score is the post-test. Because that was my first lesson, I learned as a teacher that I really needed to keep my pre-test and my post-test the same. So as I'm looking at the first integer test, they were not the same. My post-test was much harder. So I learned through my other inquiry lessons to keep the pre and post-test the same. I can compare that data, and then if I want to extend the test, I could. But I can see that overall my kids did better, especially my low kid that went from a 25 to a 62. So she definitely grew. The red is the common assessment that we are required to give within the county. So what I did is normally they cover multiple SOLs, but I only looked at integers or operations with integers. And so I can see that they did pretty well. The pre and post test for proportions, transformations, and quadrilaterals was the same for the pre and post test, so I can see a huge jump, especially for my high kids, 38 to 100, I'm looking at the proportions. And then if I look at my students who normally score low, they went from a 0 to an 80, or a 25 to an 80, and that's the exact same test. If I look at a common assessment that we're required to live in the county, she's at a 50 and a 50. So for me, I could really tell that an inquiry lesson, even though it engaged them more, I felt like they were learning more than just me giving them instruction. So you can see that here. So even my high kids, they may not get a perfect score, but they are improving on their score. And so my two middle, he made a huge jump from the pre and the post, and then my low. And then again, this here is their common assessment within the county. So if I look at, for me, I feel like if I were to reflect on this, I feel like kids made such a bigger jump on an inquiry lesson than with me just regularly teaching them in a common assessment. The only reason this is different is because when I gave the last assessment, it wasn't on the computer, so this actually also includes another SOL. But if you want to see the major growth, you have to look at the proportions and the transformations, the pre and post test, and the quadrilaterals. I don't want to move on unless I know it's not question time, but yes, ma'am.
When you're looking at your common assessment data, when was that taken? Was that before you taught the unit? Was that data from the beginning of the year, your district-wide? Was that at the end of the year?
The common assessment?
Right.
Actually, all my common assessments were actually given, they were throughout the year, so I wouldn't say it was before. It's just after I finished a unit, then I had to. And some of my inquiry levels, or my inquiry lessons, I actually, like something may have not been taught until like the fourth quarter, and I may have moved it to the third, just to fit in. I don't know if that answers or not, but overall, I guess for me, I can see those kids who normally struggle on a common assessment data that we use for the county fare much better than an inquiry lesson. So this was a big deal for me, is the use of exit tickets. I'll see if I can put them all up there. And so I never really incorporated exit tickets within my class. I wasn't sure exactly how to use them, so I used anything from a 3, 2, 1, 3 things you learn, 2 you're not familiar with, or 1 you don't get it all. I would use them as in, how did you feel about this? Inquiry is very big about how students feel about the lesson, and I've never actually really asked my students, well, how did you feel about this? I just didn't think about that. And to be honest, my kids were very honest. I told them, you're not graded on this, so tell me how you honestly feel. And I have some videos, but they truly like group work. They don't like me teaching, or they don't like any teacher. They were very specific that it gets quite boring. You'll see that. They prefer to have a student-led lesson. They like discovering things on their own, even if they struggle, and they really like playing with things. So this is one of my exit tickets. I'll read this one down here. This was given after students presented all of theirs, so that's at the very end. And it says, what activity do you feel was the most important to your learning and why? And so this student wrote, I like knowing how the quadrilaterals relate to other stuff in our life, like doors or rectangles, and while we are doing our project. And then this one said, what 2 things you learned from another group's project? So they had to actually listen to the project and then take some notes. And she said a rhombus and a square are 2 different shapes, and the relationship between a parallelogram and a rhombus. And then this student said, so it's completely different. I asked her what activity she enjoyed the most, and these are, all the activities that they did through the inquiry lesson. And she said taking down notes because you can use them to study, and sorting the shapes and the group activity. So if you cannot hear the video, I actually wrote what she put, and this was very much at the very end of the year. And so I had them reflect. I gave them a series of questions, and they had to pick which question they wanted to answer. The question is, what did you like about required lessons? I said, I like being interactive with other people, other than just like doing stuff by myself. That was really fun. And what I thought was very amazing for people to talk for a long time. Really get to know when you start to get bored and talk to speaking and stuff. And yeah. Oops, sorry. This is another one. How do you think all students can benefit from my inquiry lesson? And not just because they were my advance, I want a church to think beyond. How do you think all students can benefit from an inquiry lesson? Many students get bored or annoyed while the teacher is teaching. But if students have other students helping them, they may understand better and learn faster. So this was kind of, for me, this was an overall theme that I never questioned what my students liked. I mean, if I'm the teacher, I'm going to do what I want. But from this inquiry lesson, I really learned that they really enjoy working with each other rather than having the teacher up there taking notes. These two questions were by the same student, and so she felt like students learn more from each other, and you can interact with other students. I mean, over and over, I just kept hearing again that it gets bored while teachers up there teaching. And then this one, she likes working with new and old groups, and they really felt they could learn more from each other than from the teacher, which kind of amazed me. And so I know Jim's going to ask this, so I'll put it in here. For me, overall, probably the two biggest things, because I already talked about me being as a facilitator, so something else that I thought was really important to me was the exit tickets, because I felt like students could really be honest about what they learned, how they felt about the material, if they liked this, if they didn't. They also gave me some suggestions of changing. From one of the quadrilaterals, he's like, I learned a lot, but what about if we could try other shapes like hexagons or pentagons? And although that would be great to extend the lesson, that wasn't in my curriculum, but he still showed me how he felt. Again, one student said, why am I learning this? And then a great part for me is for me to reflect on their lessons. And the open inquiry transformations, again, I didn't connect to the real world, so I wanted to make sure that in my last inquiry that I really made a good connection. And I think the other thing that was really important for me is allow the students to have time to present to their peers, because especially in an open inquiry lesson, these two kids might be talking about the difference between a parallelogram and a rectangle, and they may never get to a square or square or rhombus. And so when another group gets there and presents, they're learning about other shapes that they may not have tested, but they're learning from their classmates. And also, I think she asked the question about debate. Two kids were debating about why a square is a rhombus. And so one kid said, that's my question. That's what I want to investigate, because I want to prove to my other student why they're different. And so it's brought up some good debate. And the proportions, one girl realized that their proportion was off because she knew she measured a student's height was less than 60 inches. So again, I think a group discussion really leads the kids learning from each other.
All right, and as I said before, I'm a special ed teacher, so I want to talk about how inquiry, how it went in my classroom. If I was lucky, I had about 8 kids. I have an enrichment class, so it's a mixture of 9th through 12th graders. And actually, a boy who had a free class kind of bounded in one day, asked if he could be part of my class. I said, sure. And I think it was Leah said that having groups of 2 is ideal, and that's how I had it set up, so it was really nice. But inquiry leads to students investigating, creating questions, thinking aloud, experimenting to answer questions, making connections to the world around us, higher order of thinking, increased student participation, and students sharing and discussing possibilities. So those are the things I'll be going over, what happened with my class. All right, so investigating, creating questions, thinking aloud. This was the best part to me because there are some kids that I've worked with since maybe 6th, 7th grade, and I really didn't know their true ability because they don't really put forth effort sometimes. If you give them a test, they're not always showing their true ability. So to give them some materials and tell them to go at it, you're really hearing what they are thinking. And so I had one student, we were working with radiometers, and it was just basically to help generate questions. He said, I wonder if wind will make it move. So he ran out of the classroom, and another teacher told me later on that he was like, I'm excited, so he ran outside, helped, he studied the radiometer on something that would not affect whether wind would make it work or not, and came back in and told the whole class whether, wind affected the radiometer. So it was really neat to see him get so excited about it and actually, create a question right there, go outside and test it immediately and bring back his results. I didn't focus, and this is what my next round, like for next year, what I'll be focusing on is actually creating better testable questions. I was just so excited about the fact that my kids were thinking and making these connections that I didn't really hold them so strictly to how they formatted their questions. Experimenting to answer questions, making connections to the world around us. Again, the students were taking their prior knowledge and using it to figure out how these things work, and I was amazed because they were showing what their prior knowledge is. I didn't know that they had any. So, because they don't offer any information. If you're in class and you ask a question, they're not raising their hands. If you have them in a group project, they're sitting back. They're not participating. They're not offering any assistance. They want everybody else to do their job. And this way, in a small class with 8 kids, they're all at the same advantage or disadvantage. They all have to work. Because of kids creating their own questions, then they have to figure out how to solve their own question. They became more confident with sharing their answers. So when it came time to present data, they felt good about getting up and writing down their answers. They weren't hiding behind someone else saying, you go do it. They actually got up and felt really good about it. They like to have materials to manipulate, to play with, to experiment. And the kids that would normally sit back were now fully engaged and just having fun. So it was really, really great to see this participation and visually see their minds working. As far as student growth, with the group of kids I had, because they were in different grade levels, there were some kids that were older and had remembered a little bit more from what they had learned previously. So when it came to grouping, I did kind of scatter those kids just for a little more support. But basically, they all started out kind of weak in that area, and then by the time I post-test, they jumped dramatically with their scores. So they really did absorb and remember and understand a lot of the content that was being covered. And I just put down at the bottom the students that I was working with. So it was a variety of students. Some of them had specific learning disorders. Some of them had other health impairments, which usually means ADHD. And then I had one student who had an emotional disorder. So again, it covers a wide variety of types of students, and it really worked well for all of them. The type of inquiry that went really well with my class was open inquiry. They seemed to like it a lot better than structured or guided because, again, they got to be the teachers. They got to help each other and work together and not have me so much involved, which, again, that was hard for me also. I had to kind of step back because I'm so used to kids saying, I don't know how to do this. Tell me what I'm supposed to do. What's the answer? And this was great because they were coming up with everything on their own. Towards the end, I did ask some of my kids, 6 out of the 8 of the students, what they thought about this experience. So out of the 6, they all really enjoyed open inquiry. So I had done 2 open inquiry lessons. The one was with the radiometer just to generate questions, testable questions. The second one was using sugar cubes to learn about weathering. And they liked the weathering lesson the best. 3 of the 6 did not like the math, more of the math lessons. I did one with using blueprints and one ordering percents, decimals, and fractions. So they weren't really into the math, but I know that they did learn more from using an inquiry lesson than if I did a traditional lesson. And then 6 out of 6 said they preferred to learn hands-on. So that's why they like the open inquiry lessons.